When you think about space these days, you're probably not thinking about national space programs like NASA or the space race of the 20th century. You're thinking about private companies like Blue Origin or SpaceX leading the way into the future. But the reality is these private companies depend on national ecosystems of different businesses and regulatory environments in order to allow them to pioneer in the future. Compared to space development of the past century, these days the space domain looks very different. It's overpopulated with both national and private company satellites, as well as thinking about more future-oriented technologies, research in space, even things like mining further out in space for energy or critical minerals. What that means today is companies or countries that are seeking to build space programs have a lot of challenges, and so in order to grab a new part of that domain, they need to not only build the launch capabilities, the satellite technologies, the communication technologies to orbit the Earth, but they also need to work transnationally with other companies and with other countries in this multilateral domain. If you think about it this way, unlike the Earth, where territory boundaries are a really big part of how we think about building an industry, in space, those territory markers aren't there. You're building across borders inherently from the get-go as soon as you launch your first vehicle. For a country to build a space program, they need to have launch capabilities, they need to have satellite capabilities, and they also need to have a launch site or access to a launch site. If we look at those capabilities in terms of scale and quantity, then it's only the United States, China, and Russia that has a full space program. But then most countries that are building their space program have one aspect of those capabilities and are building toward having more. Depending on where your country is located on the globe, you might not have a viable site on which you could launch these vehicles into space, which means making partnerships with other countries that do have those locations especially important. Developing these resources to be able to compete on the international stage requires funneling a lot of resources. That includes building the technologies, which requires having the human capital, the education, the training, in order to tackle these very different technological problems. You also need to have the materials, the stuff, the chemistry, and the physics in order to put together these components that are going to last in space, because the space environment is so different than the environment that we have here on Earth. Finally, you're going to need an immense amount of financing because these are very costly projects and they have very long time frames. There's a reason why we don't hear about having a big launch every day. One country we can look at that's funneled a lot of resources and energy into building its space program quite recently is South Korea, which is really interesting to learn from for a variety of reasons. First, it's such a latecomer to the space domain compared to the big countries like the United States, China, and Russia, or other countries that have been in the space domain like Europe or Japan for decades now. So Korea's at a really big disadvantage in trying to catch up in all three of those capabilities in this really saturated domain. But what's interesting is just how they're trying to do it. Korea has built this triangle cluster project of 3 cities that are going to be specialized in building each of those 3 capabilities. So we have a launch site in the south, we have an area that's specializing in satellite technology and the materials of it, and we have another site that's focused on technical development. What this means is that they're able to divide and conquer, in a sense, this big challenge of entering a domain so late. What's interesting about Korea is 2 things that we can learn from. First, the governance of this is really interesting because Korea has such a strong track record of catching up in many industrial domains, including high-tech sectors. For example, thinking about big companies like Samsung or LG, where Korea dominates the market in things like smartphones, semiconductors. Now they have a lot of really great technologies in batteries. They've been able to do this through a really concerted government policy of catching up in a short period of time. The other important thing here is Korea has strong industrial presence in high-tech sectors that lend themselves well to entering the space domain. I mean, chips is a really good example of this because you need to have really different components in order to last in space. And because Korea has not only the material capabilities, but also the technology in order to develop these next-gen chips, they're able to overcome some of the barriers that other countries have that don't have these industries. Some of the most important innovations that are happening here aren't big companies, but they're startups. So we know a lot of companies in the United States that are making the big strides, like SpaceX and Blue Origin, are backed by billionaires. But some of the innovations, the operational things that are doing the most nimble work are in the startup sector. So building those bridges between academia and the private sector is a really important government role that South Korea is trying to do. And they have a really strong track record in this. They've done this in different material sciences. This is how they helped leapfrog their automotive industry. You know, you think about Hyundai and Kia, these are global companies. And a lot of it was because the government helped form partnerships between the researchers and the engineers and the companies that are actually producing these things. So Korea is using that same proven model to leapfrog its space program as well.